Thank you, Shantigarba, for that very warm introduction. As I said, I'm really delighted to be a part of this so important, so crucial conversation. Um, I would like to start with something Noam Chomsky said in an interview last year. I'm not sure how familiar people are with Chomsky, but he's a major intellectual and social critic here in the US. He said, "We are now living in the most dangerous time in human history," which is quite a thing to say, needless. Um, I immediately tried to think of some counterexamples, but I couldn't, you know. I think he's right. I think that, and he doesn't only talk about the climate crisis or the larger ecological breakdown, but nonetheless, that's the first thing he mentions, and I think that's certainly the one that kind of swamps everything else. Um, in the way that what we do or don't do in the next decade or so is going to have huge ramifications for many generations, probably for many centuries to come. Um, and of course, the question for us here is, what does Buddhism have to offer that can help us understand and respond to it? I mean, one answer is maybe nothing. The Buddha lived in a very different time and place, as Shantigarba mentioned. Iron Age India, he certainly didn't face the kinds of technological problems that we're facing or ecological problems that we're facing now. But nonetheless, I think there are really important implications that are kind of built into his teachings. That we can draw out. And perhaps the most important one is the one that was already mentioned. I think the Bodhisattva Path, especially if we understand it in kind of a non-sectarian way, not simply as a way that Mahayana sort of asserts its superiority over Theravada, something like that, but rather as pointing to the way of living in the world that clearly, I would say, we need to be exploring and developing in response to the situation that we now find ourselves in. To begin, I'm reminded of two short Zen stories. When we remember the magnitude of the challenge we're facing, I remember this little one where a student asked the master, "What should we do when difficult times come?" And this is a little hard to show on the in the camera, but basically the master held out his arms as if to give an embrace. Welcome, welcome. In other words, our path is not about avoiding difficult times. It's not as though we should think of the difficult times as a distraction from the path that we're trying to follow, but it's actually an essential part of it, as I'll try to unpack. The other Zen story that comes to mind, it was a student of the Chinese Chan teacher Yunmen who asked him, "What is the fruit of a lifetime of practice?" And Yunmen replied, "Responding appropriately." Responding appropriately. In other words, we should never think of our Buddhist path as a way to transcend the world or become indifferent to it. Rather, it's a way of feeling more engaged with it. Um, Maybe that's the best way to express it, to respond more adequately to it. But again, this challenge, how do we respond appropriately to something so enormous? And that's why I think the Bodhisattva path is so important today. I would like to talk about three aspects of it, which I think for me sort of get to the heart of what it's about. The first aspect is the fact that bodhisattvas have a double path, or I suppose you might say a two-sided path. In other words, they continue to work on their own individual practice, their meditation, chanting, whatever that may be. But they also realize that that's insufficient, that they also need to be engaged in the world, helping people. And it's not simply that these two paths sort of go nicely together. I think more fundamentally, if we really get at to what this is pointing at, I think we can see that these two paths or these two sides of the path need each other. Many of us are familiar with, eco-activists, socially engaged activists, even if we're not engaged ourselves. And, we know it's it's a very difficult path in the sense that it's not easy to avoid getting burned out, frustrated, angry. And that's why something like a Buddhist or some kind of contemplative path can be really important in helping us find and recover the kind of equanimity that we need in order not to lose our balance, in order not to get burned out. But it works the other way around as well, that I think if we really understand the Buddhist path, we can see how it naturally unfolds to include some kind of social engagement. When we start out, when we first come to Buddhist practice, I think in almost every case we do it because there's some dissatisfaction in our lives. There's some problem. Our lives are not working as well as we'd like them to. And so inevitably at the beginning of our practice, I think there tends to be a certain sort of self-preoccupation, What's in it for me? Well, it's finding some equanimity. And yet, as we become more engaged, as we get more deeply into the practice and experience more what that involves, I think we begin to understand that that kind of self-preoccupation, again, what's in it for me, the dangerous presumption there is that somehow my own well-being is going to be separate from the well-being of other people. In other words, as we really get more deeply into the path, we can see how we need to overcome that fundamental self-preoccupation because that's at the heart of our dukkha, right? I'm reminded of a wonderful quotation by a Neo-Vedanta teacher, Nisargadatta, who said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life turns." Wow. That's really Buddhism, isn't it? We're talking about the two pillars, the two wings of the Buddhist path, right? Wisdom and love, or as we more often say, wisdom and compassion. And what I think is really important about this quotation is that Nisargadatta shows us the relationship between the two, right? I mean, love here, as he expresses it, it's not just a feeling, right? Love is a way of being in the world that embodies, that develops the wisdom that he talked about, the wisdom of realizing our non-duality or our non-separation, right, from other people. Franz Kafka, in a letter in one of his letters, I think he expressed this really very well, when he said, "You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world. That's something you're free to do. But perhaps your very holding back is the one suffering you could avoid." Why? Because that holding back goes to the heart of our suffering, which is the delusion of a separate self. Can you all hear me now? Okay, great. Did you, I don't know when we got lost there. Did you hear the quotation from Kafka? Did that come
Yes,
through okay?
we just
Great.
lost about 30 seconds after the quotation.
Okay, great, right. Um, I think in a way the quotation speaks for itself. Um, I think that many of us, many in the Buddhist world, we still have a certain romanticized idea about practice somehow, that we can go off by ourselves, say like Milarepa in the Tibetan tradition, who, supposedly, um, secluded himself for many decades, lived on nettles that turned his skin green, and went all the way to Buddhahood in the process of doing that, right? And somehow I think it's very deep in many Buddhists, the idea, don't bother me with social issues, leave me alone. When I'm deeply enlightened, then I'll come back and engage. And I think that's a very dangerous misunderstanding of the path. Um, I think Joanna Macy put it very well when she said, the world has a role to play in our awakening. And I remember my own Zen experience when I first started practicing, how living in the Maui Zendo, it was pretty intense, even if we weren't a conventional meditation center, but we sat very hard. Experiences, insights were not that uncommon. But I wasn't the only one who realized that more challenging, more difficult was integrating what we were realizing into how we actually related to other people. Because your self-preoccupied habits don't automatically just disappear just because you have a moment of selflessness or insight into the nature of reality. Those are still functioning. And how do we overcome those habits? It's by getting out and engaging with the world, right? I also remember something that Ram Dass liked to say. So you think you're enlightened, huh? Well, go spend the holidays with your family. Um, go spend the holidays in a situation, right, where people have these expectations and you have these habits in terms of how you relate to them, Um, his understanding is that, the path is a self-sharpening tool in the sense that we meditate, things happen, we go out, we relate to other people, we see where we're still stuck. And then that feeds back into our practice. And I think it's all the more so in the case of social engagement, especially ecological engagement, right? Um, as Kobo Daishi, one of the founders of Japanese Zen put it, Japanese Buddhism, the measure of our enlightenment is how we serve others. Bob Thurman here in the US, he used to like to say, people are always talking about practice, practice, practice. What I want to know is, when is the performance? And I think the point here is that the performance, how we actually live in the world, that becomes part of our practice. We learn from that. It's that interaction between the two that becomes so important. Or we can say it in a different way, that the person who benefits most from the engagement, the social engagement of a bodhisattva, is the bodhisattva herself or himself, right? So again, this first point, understanding the importance of bringing these two sides of the coin, this double practice, integrating it in how we actually live. The second point that I want to emphasize is connected with the fact that I think, frankly, we have a somewhat deeper understanding of dukkha today than is expressed in the Buddhist canon, which I know is kind of a radical thing to say. So let me try to unpack that, right? Frankly, it does seem to me that the Buddha was probably, again, I'm basing this on what he said, what's recorded in the Pali Canon. I think the Buddha was probably more progressive than the institution that developed after he died, right? When you look at his attitude toward women in caste, right? India at that time and still very, very patriarchal. And yet he created a women's Sangha based on the realization that women had the same Buddha nature, the same potential to awaken. And likewise, when you joined either of the Buddhist Sanghas, you lost all caste, right? I guess the relationship today would be something with racism, in the sense that the Buddha did not distinguish socially in that way. And the implication is that he had some insight into how patriarchy and the caste system were causes of dukkha at that time in India. And yet, after he died, what happened? Well, um, the woman Sangha slowly disappeared, frankly, I think because probably the the monks didn't like the competition, if I'm quite honest here. In any case, India reverted. Uh, Buddhism became patriarchal, and indeed, all of the Asian Buddhist societies are patriarchal to some degree. Um, and also caste. I mean, it's interesting the way that the Buddha, um, after the Buddha died, this new cult, right? It's concerned about surviving and thriving, and so it has to be careful about its relationship with kings and other authorities. And so it's not going to challenge them in the way that, say, the Hebrew prophets did. Or, rather, the karma teaching could be used, and I think was used, to sort of rationalize the power of the king. If someone's born a prince, right, he must have very good karma. And indeed, basically, what happened to the karma system is that in traditional Buddhist teachings, if you are suffering, if you have dukkha, it is due to it. Basically, it's your own fault, right? Don't blame anybody else. You have to look at your past actions in this lifetime or in previous lifetimes. And frankly, I think that is no longer acceptable. I once heard a Tibetan teacher say, "Oh, what terrible karma all of those Jews in Nazi Germany must have had to be born at that time in that place." And frankly, I don't think that sort of attitude is acceptable anymore, blaming the victim. I think we know much more about social forces, how people can get caught up. And basically, what I'm pointing to is the fact that we can't simply understand the three poisons, the traditional three poisons or three fires: greed, ill will, delusion. We can't simply understand them as working only on an individual level, but we have to understand that in some degree they have been institutionalized. For example, if greed means you never have enough, well, I think that's a pretty good description of our economic system, both the consumerism that it encourages, but also think of corporations, how they're never profitable enough, their market share is never high enough, their share price is never high enough. More and more is the name of the game. And isn't that institutionalized delusion? Likewise, institutionalized ill will, well, there's a number of versions of that. Here in the United States, I think the classic one might be our militarism. The fact that we spend, maybe say it this way, if we here in the United States, and you'll have to apply this as you like in England, Germany, or elsewhere, but if you measure by the amount of resources that is put into the military, I think it's pretty obvious that the United States is the most militarized society in human history. And of course, that gives us the opportunity and indeed the freedom to sort of throw our weight around in the way that we do, in the way that we end up bombing lots of other countries and so forth. Anyway, I throw that out as one example of institutionalized ill will, and likewise institutionalized delusion. Today, we're all familiar with fake news, but also the fact that so much of the media is privately owned. They themselves are corporations, that they're not really so much interested in educating or informing us about what's really going on. That is subordinate to the emphasis on finding ways to grab our attention, our eyeballs, and sell it to the highest bidder. In other words, they end up reinforcing consumerism that way, that there's always a kind of a economic capitalist slant to the way that they understand and present the news. Anyway, one could go on in that fashion, but I think you can see where I'm going here, the importance of um, understanding that the problems we're facing today cannot simply be reduced to individual karma, but we have to see how they are also structural. And that means there's also the challenge of a structural or a collective response. At least here in the United States, I can't say for the UK. Um, I think in the last generation or so, we've gotten a lot better at uh, sort of individualized bodhisattva activity in the sense of individuals helping individuals, maybe soup kitchens for homeless people or um, prison dharma or hospice, that kind of thing. Or to say it another way, I think we have become better at pulling drowning people out of the river, but we still face this challenge. Who or what is pushing them in the river upstream? Why is it that there are so many more drowning people, to keep the metaphor? How do we understand and how do we respond to these kinds of structural challenges? Certainly, we can see in relationship to the ecological, we see the problem of fossil fuel corporations and their programs of misinformation and the pressure, the way that they're able to subvert the democratic process, at least here in the United States, with campaign contributions and so forth. When Bill McKibben was in Paris for the Eco Talks a few years ago, he was asked by a woman, "What can I do as an individual?" And he responded, "Stop being an individual." And of course, he's not meaning that completely. And certainly, I think we all do have a responsibility to reduce our own individual carbon footprint. But it's really important to realize that that's not the only thing, or I would even say the main thing, that we also need to work together to transform the way that the economic system is working for, to address the structural forces that are defending fossil fuels and that sort of thing. And it's interesting because I think that's also a challenge for our Buddhist Sanghas. Speaking again, at least here in the United States, when I think about the three treasures, we have lots of Buddha, that is to say, teachers, we have lots of Dharma teachings, but in many ways, we're still a bit weak on Sangha. And it seems to me as things continue to deteriorate ecologically, that's perhaps going to be the most important thing of all. Are we part of a community? Are we part of a loving community where people are there for each other to help each other? If we're going to successfully address structural, institutionalized challenges, we have to work together as groups rather than understanding the challenge as something that simply requires an individual response. That's the second point, that I think our understanding of dukkha, suffering today, that we need a broader vision that doesn't simply understand karma on the individual level, but looks at what you might call not only institutionalized dukkha, but institutionalized karma. The third point is, and final point, is that it seems to me the Bodhisattva path doesn't tell us what to do. And that makes sense, right? You look at all the Asian Buddhist traditions, they didn't have our problem. What the Bodhisattva path does do is tell us how to do it. It gives a lot of advice about how to engage in whatever it is that we decide to become involved with. Um, and there's a lot of different things one could talk about here, but I would like to focus on one that I think, for me, it really stands out because I think it speaks to the particular frustration and grief and even despair that many of us feel about the situation we're now in. What I mean by this is that one of the most important characteristics of bodhisattva activity is that bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results of their actions, right? In fact, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha says that one characteristic of an awakened person, the actions of an awakened person, is that their actions are nirasa, which can be translated without expectation or even perhaps without hope. And you even find this in the Lojong teaching of Tibet, right? Aphorism 28 emphasizes abandon hope or expectation of fruition. Don't get caught up in the future, stay in the present moment. But what does that have to do with social activism? I think it's easy to misunderstand, especially because Buddhism emphasizes so much our motivation, the intention behind our actions. And so we might think that means, well, it doesn't matter if what I do has any effect. The only thing that's important is my pure motivation. And I think that's a really dangerous misunderstanding. So I'd like to end by kind of unpacking, trying to unpack a bit what it means to act without attachment to the results. To begin with, please reflect with me for a moment on the difference between running a 100-meter dash and a marathon, right? When you're running a 100-meter dash, you don't have time to think about anything but getting to the other end as quickly as possible. But needless to say, you cannot run a marathon that way, right? You're going to burn yourself out really quickly. What you need to do is to be going in the right direction for sure. But instead of focusing on the goal, you need to focus, just like that Lojong aphorism said, right? Stay in the present moment. You need to focus on what's happening right here and now. Just this step. You don't have to worry about the goal. If you're going in this direction, you will sooner or later get there. But for the moment, it's just this step. In fact, in Japanese, there's a term for it, tada, just this. And even in the earlier Buddhist teachings, tathata, just thisness, right? And of course, this is what our practice, has always encouraged us to do. When our minds wander, return to the now, except that in our engagement, in our engaged activity as well, we should do this, right? But there's more to say. A marathon, okay, sooner or later you're going to get there. It's what, 26 miles or something. What about a race? Well, let's not call it a race. What about a path that has no end? You could say a task, if you were, social engagement that has no end, such as, in the Mahayana tradition, saving all sentient beings or helping all living beings to wake up, however we might understand that. I'm thinking, of course, of the 4 Bodhisattva vows that are recited in Zen monasteries every day. And the first one says exactly that. Living beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Now, if we really understand what that commitment means, how can we avoid feeling overwhelmed? Because we're vowing to do something that literally cannot be accomplished, right? But actually, that's not the problem. That's the real point of it. Since the goal of saving all sentient beings in the universe, since that goal is not something that you or I are going to accomplish, what the vow is really calling for is a reorientation in the meaning of one's life, right? Away from our usual self-preoccupation, what's in it for me, with, what can I do to make this a better world for everyone? Realizing that we're all part of each other, right? So what becomes important on a day-to-day level is not the unattainable goal, but the direction of your effort. And if we're successful in what we do, that's nice, but we don't get preoccupied in congratulating ourselves. There's always plenty more to do. And likewise, if we're frustrated, we don't let that stop us, but we find a different way to act, uh, a different way to approach the problem, or maybe we realize that that's not the problem that needs to be addressed right now at all. That sounds like a never-ending hassle, but actually it's not, right? Once we begin to get insight and realize our non-duality with other people, this is what we want to do. This is the meaning of one's life, right? This is how we want to live. It becomes our passion and our joy, right? To live in a way that as much as possible embodies this vow. And of course, in the process, fitting in with what I was saying earlier, how this reorients our habitual ways of thinking and acting in the world, and we become less self-preoccupied, which is so much at the heart of our dukkha suffering. But finally, there's a third point here that also stands out here. In fact, it stands out most of all, because frankly, if we're honest, the climate crisis or ecological emergency looks very difficult, as we know. And there's the very real possibility that our efforts are going to be in vain because we are so close, or maybe have already passed tipping points. And certainly, there are some scientists themselves who, at least in private, have become very pessimistic. It's very difficult to anticipate what's going to happen, but in many ways, it doesn't look good. We just don't know. Have you heard that before? We just don't know. Is that familiar? At least in the Zen world, this is something that we cultivate. Huh? Don't know mind. Huh? Not knowing is most intimate. The Zen peacemakers, the first of their three principles are uh, not knowing, followed by bearing witness to the joys and suffering of the world, and then taking actions that arise from that not knowing and bearing witness. The importance of not knowing here is that it it enables us to be much more spacious, more aware of our own reactivity, more open to the perspective of others, not so fixated. But it's more of a way of engaging with the world right as it is, here and now. We don't know what's going to happen next, but we do the best we can, responding appropriately as best we can according to what we understand. But at the same time, we're ready to change that as our understanding of the situation changes. One of my teachers, Robert Aiken, liked to say that our task isn't about clearing up the mystery, but making the mystery clear. The spiritual path isn't about, oh, now I understand everything, but opening up to a mysterious and sacred world where everything is changing, whether we know it or not. And, Bodhisattvas access this mystery not by kind of grabbing it and understanding it, but opening up to it, being taken by it. That's the sense in which we end up transcending our egos. And therefore, this awesome mystery isn't something debilitating, but empowering, because it does liberate us from dogmatism and fixed ideas. We do the best we can, although we understand that we never know for sure what's happening or even what's possible, right? I'm not talking here about hope. It's a very important distinction here. Hope is part of a duality, hope and despair, or hope and fear. And the danger is that if we are motivated by hope, there's always the danger that we're going to be flipping over, because the desire, the hope, it always comes with the obverse, which is a fear that what we hope for won't happen. Whereas for bodhisattvas, what's motivating them is something much deeper, a compassionate generosity of spirit that, of course, wants to express itself and, does naturally seek results, but doesn't require them. Here, I'm really struck by something Joanna Macy said. Quote, I find that assuring people there's hope, including myself, isn't all that useful. In Buddhism, there is no word for hope. It would be viewed as a distraction. It takes you out of the present moment and into conjecture. All we can really affirm is where we want to put our attention. We have a choice. Do we give up and surrender to the great unraveling? Or do we join those working for a livable future? Since the outcome is uncertain, we have to enjoy doing something exhilarating and useful without knowing for sure how it's going to work out. I think that's brilliant. I think that's essential. Wendell Berry, one of our great American writers, said something very similar when he said, "We don't have the right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have the right to ask is, what's the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it?" Both of them are pointing, I think, to the deepest meaning of non-attachment to results, which is simply this. Our task is to do the very best we can, not knowing what the consequences will be, not knowing if anything we do is going to make any difference whatsoever. And since that to me is the most important point of all, I'm going to forget it, repeat it. Our task is to do the best we can, not knowing what the results are going to be, not knowing if our efforts will make any difference whatsoever. Have we already passed ecological tipping points and civilization as we know it is doomed? We don't know, but the fact that we don't know, that's okay. Of course, there's intention in the sense that we try to be strategic in terms of what we do. It's not as though we don't care or not whether it happens. We'd like it to happen. Yet ultimately, what we do is our gift to the earth. Gratis. You don't give a gift to someone or to something. You don't give a gift with the expectation of some return. Then it's not really a gift, right? In other words, we don't know, we can't know if what we do is important, but it's important for us, very important for us to do it. Now, of course, I'm talking here about an ideal. And to be so unattached is obviously going to be a challenge. And it doesn't mean that we're necessarily always going to live up to that. But the whole point of being a Buddhist practitioner is we have a way of dealing with that frustration. We have a way of becoming unattached to what we've been doing. And that's our meditation practice. In other words, our job isn't to be perfect, but to do the best we can. And I think Buddhism here shows us the path forward, right? Now, frankly, in conclusion, it seems to me that if we Buddhists don't want to do something like this, or can't do something like this, follow this kind of Bodhisattva, new Bodhisattva, Ecosattva path, if we're unwilling or unable to do it, then frankly, it seems to me Buddhism wouldn't be what the world needs now. But of course, what I've just tried to explain is to sort of show how, in fact, this path, the way that it has been articulated, the way that we can adapt it to our situation, that this might well be the single most important Buddhist contribution to the situation that we find ourselves in now, this greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced, according to Noam Chomsky. So I'll leave it at that for the moment and open it up to some discussion if people are interested. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, David. Found that very inspiring and challenging as well. I really enjoy how you offer paradox and the spirit of non-duality, which seems to be the Bodhisattva spirit, and that kind of playful paradox of different ideas and so on. So there were many things as we went through that I wanted to touch on, but I'd also like to open it up to questions from the from everybody on the Zoom. So if you have a question, do you want to start writing in the chat? And could you keep it to about 3 sentences max, so that I don't, not the essay version, but just like 2 or 3 sentences so I could read it out. Yeah. Thanks very much. So I'll give people a chance to do that. And while we're just giving them a chance to write something in the chat, I guess I wanted to just pick up on something you mentioned quite early on, Yun Men responding appropriately. And it's something I ask when I'm doing workshops. It's something I ask, well, what would be a proportionate response to the scale of the current climate and ecological emergency? It's very difficult to imagine. And as you say beautifully, that's the point. Yeah. It's very, very difficult to imagine, what would be a proportionate response.
So if I could just make one quick response to that, I don't know if it's an appropriate response, but I'll do my best here. We individually don't need to save the world, right? We're not going to save the world, and feeling that pressure is part of the delusion that causes suffering. But the question is, what role can I play? And as a response to my book and what a lot of other people and the Ecodharma Center that we started, I do very often get these questions of people say, I want to be an Ecosattva, but I don't know what to do. What should I do? And in response to that, I've recently come up with a 3-part meditation that I think can be very helpful. And I just want to mention that very briefly. Number one, I think it's really important for us to begin with a kind of a ruthless self-evaluation. What do I have to offer, taking into account everything? Health, age, educational background, hobbies, skills, context, networks, and so forth. Whether or not we need to make money, whether or not we're retired, et cetera, et cetera. Really reflect on that. Number two, what are the needs? What are the possibilities for me? I mean, there are obviously so many things, and we have to discriminate. We have to choose where our particular energy might be the most hopeful. And then third, having digested and in a way kind of assimilated or forgotten those first two, to kind of meditate and ask in a very deep way, given that context, what tugs at my heart? Where does my love, where does my compassion want to express itself? And in a way, that calls for us for a decision or a response that's deeper than ego. I think if we can meditate on this in the right way, it can kind of help open us up where we really feel drawn. Something deeper in us is drawn to a particular focus or a particular path here. So I just want to mention those three because I think they can be very, that kind of 3-part meditation can be very helpful. And I don't know that any of us can answer that question for anybody else. We have to decide ourselves. And I think that kind of contemplation practice can be very helpful. Okay, leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you. So a comment from Christine, it's a comment rather than a question. Blown away by David's wisdom and synthesis. Okay. And Devan, from Devan up in Chester. Could you say something about what you're doing at the Rocky Mountain Eco-Buddhist Center? How does it compare with Ecodharma in Spain?
Yes, very good question. I've had an opportunity to visit the Ecodharma Center, and in many ways, we don't compare. I mean, they have a very large staff. They're doing lots of really exciting things. We're just getting started. We're still paying off the mortgage, and we're much smaller. We don't have a resident community. What we do is we make our facilities available to lots of different teachers and groups that hire it out for a weekend or a week. But the thing I'm most excited about is that with a fellow founder and co-teacher, Johan Robbins, we have been sort of working out what we call Ecodharma Retreats or Ecodharma, I guess I'd call it Ecodharma Retreat, except it has some workshop-y elements. Also quite influenced by Joanna Macy in the sense that, we not only spend as much time as we can outdoors, in meditating, connecting with nature, with the trees, with the brook, with the wildflowers and the meadow and so forth. And we also kind of follow something that she emphasized, the importance of gratitude as a grounding that we need to tap into in order to move into what maybe is most transformative, which is getting in touch with our grief. I think that many of us are shut down here. You know, we're so intimidated and sad about what's happened that we just can't deal with it, and we tend to. But when you've got a group of people who've been meditating together, living together 24/7 for several days, and then we start talking about this, it's so it's it it's so moving. It's like we share our grief, and you know, we find that it's very, very powerful, very liberating. And then right after that, we go off and do a 2-day, 2-night solo off in the land, where people are encouraged, you know, don't have an agenda, but open up. What does this beautiful place, what does it have to offer you? And then we end with this kind of 3-part meditation that I just talked about. And frankly, I think we're finding this very, very powerful, very, very transformative. So that's, I guess, what I'm most excited about now, and that's what we're focused on at the moment. It's not something that all the groups that use the center do, but more and more, it's what we're trying to focus on. Yeah.
Mm.
Apologies for the long reply, which was more than 3 sentences.
Thank you very much. So those two topics, gratitude and grief, and how they're connected with each other, how going into the one leads to the other, and vice versa. Yeah.
So
Yeah. And Joanna Macy saying, famously saying, if we don't address the grief, we're not going anywhere with, you know, our activism, you know, because the grief is going to get in the way. The grief is what's going to make it difficult for us to act effectively in the world. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay, so any more questions in the chat? I'm not seeing any more questions.
I'm sure that everything I said wasn't all that completely clear or persuasive, so don't be shy to push back. I mean, I was saying some pretty challenging things. You know, I'm thinking Buddhism has to change. You know, I think we have to really acknowledge, number one, this is incredibly dangerous time. And we have to ask how, you know, we have to look at institutionalized greed, institutionalized ill will, institutionalized delusion and karma, and figure out ways to address that. I mean, what I think is exciting is, well, one of the things that's so exciting is that from the beginning, Buddhism has emphasized impermanence and insubstantiality, and that applies to itself. How Buddhism, we've seen how it changes as it goes to different cultures in Asia. It doesn't just impose itself, it interacts, right? The Buddha didn't teach Zen. Zen developed in China and Japan. And now Buddhism comes to the modern world in crisis. This is the greatest challenge ever to Buddhism as well. And we really need to question as deeply as we can to see, you know, what this wonderful tradition has to offer, but also what this wonderful tradition might have to learn in order to respond most appropriately to this very challenging situation.
Okay, thanks, David. So now you've got people going. Now you've got the questions coming in. Maybe briefly, how would you engage with climate skeptics in your Buddhist tradition?
You know, that's a really good question. And part of the difficulty answering it is that the climate skeptics are not the ones who come to our retreats, right? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, but I do think there's a momentum here, and maybe it's some of the same momentum as if with COVID skepticism, in the sense that, you know, when I first started to try to talk about ecodharma or you know, ecological activism, frankly, Buddhist communities weren't all that interested or all that focused. I was quite shocked. It didn't go anywhere. You know, I co-edited a book, A Buddhist Response to the Climate Emergency, that no one ever heard about. And it's only in the last few years that things have really picked up. And I think that's because the situation is deteriorating. And I think that's what's going to deal with the skeptics, the fact that the climate continues to warm up. You know, we're getting these extreme weather events. We're getting forest fires and droughts here in the US West. And I think that, more than anything else that I have to say, is probably what's going to be the most influential. Other than that, I don't have any special insight into how to deal with that question. Yeah.
Good, thank you. Okay, here's another one from Singha Shraddha. How would you engage with Buddhists who say that politics should stay out of Buddhism? I think you addressed that to some extent at the beginning, kind of towards the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we need to understand that politics is a source of dukkha, and politics can also be a way to relieve dukkha. In other words, I think the kind of aloof stance that Buddhism has often had, where, we're going to hide out in a cave and let all this work itself out. I mean, I don't think we have that option anymore. Buddhism, what happens to Buddhism too, it's not going to be, there's no way that's ever going to be immune from the kind of great unraveling that Joanna Macy, talks about. I guess what I'm saying is, I think politics is inescapable if we go back to the fundamental principle of the Buddha, right? He said, all he taught was dukkha and how to end it. Well, where is the dukkha coming from? And how do we address that dukkha? And if we have the delusion that we're going to be able to do it just by disconnecting and dissociating ourselves from the rest of the world and focusing on our meditation, I think that's too one-sided, and it just isn't going to work, especially in the kind of time frame that we find ourselves in now. Anyway, I could say more, but I think that's the basic idea. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, maybe just one more. I'm not sure I fully understood this, but anyway, Michael says, the Buddha said that the giving of the Dharma is the best of all givings. That bit I understand. This is true of ecological purposes, which sees the Dharma in world development. Does that make sense to you?
Maybe not. Could you read it again, please?
Yeah, okay, maybe. The Buddha said that the giving of the Dharma is the best of all givings. Yeah, we've got that. This is true of ecological purposes, which sees the Dharma in world development.
Again, I'm not sure that I understand, but
Okay.
I don't know. I think the basic approach of my talk is a particular way of understanding and expressing the Dharma. And if what I've been trying to say is true, I think this is an extremely important contribution to the kind of situation that we find ourselves today. So, this might also be understood as part of that great gift that the Buddha has to offer. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. I think we'll close it there. And thank you again. I really appreciate your time and energy, and just really a sense of as I said, the Bodhisattva spirit, really something, the sense of generosity and openness and curiosity and love that comes across so clearly. So thank you very much.
Thank you for this invitation, and I'm really so happy that you're doing this program and delighted to be a small part of it. So
thank you.
Keep up the good work, everyone.
Thank you.
And I hope we'll continue to be in touch.
Yes, yeah, me too.